We begin with a little baseball, and you know what? I'm in a much more chipper mood today about the Yankees after the interview that Meredith Morakovitz had on the S Network with Brian Cashman, their general manager, last night, and feeling a lot better about where the Yankees stand in their pursuit of DJ LeMahieu. There was a report a couple days ago, Buster Olney, ESPN, saying the Yankees won match 5 for 100. You know, I had CJ Nitkowski on the day that you were off, Maggie, middle of the week on Wednesday, and he said, well, there's a point to where the Yankees would go for DJ LeMahieu. They're not going to go crazy on DJ LeMahieu, and we'll see exactly where that market is. But you know, as Luke Voigt told the show, DJ wants to be here. Brian Cashman reiterated that last night. The Yankees reiterated their affection and love for DJ LeMahieu as well. There are a lot of headlines that came out of that Cashman interview. We'll get to Gary, We'll get to Gleyber Torres, but as far as LeMahieu goes, Brian Cashman said, yes, financially, we're going to be the highest spending team in all of Major League Baseball. The commitment from Hal Steinbrenner to this team, to this organization, to the fan base is absolutely unquestioned. I feel a lot better today than I have probably in the last 3 or 4 days about the Yankees. I said at the time, I needed to see it in order to believe it. If LeMahieu was putting on, say, a Met uniform or a Blue Jay uniform, when the Yankees target a guy that they won, as we saw last offseason with Garrett Cole, and historically speaking, they usually get that guy. They usually don't fall short when it's free agency. Now the market needs to develop. We'll see where it goes. Did hedge it a little bit, but the Yankees are committed to getting DJ LeMahieu back in pinstripes.
Yeah, if you were going to do winners and losers coming out of that Cashman interview, I think DJ LeMahieu is definitely a winner. I would say that Gary Sanchez is a winner coming out of that interview because of the outright defense of Gary Sanchez by Brian Cashman. Masahiro Tanaka would be a big loser coming out of that interview because I have not seen Brian Cashman sidestep a question in that way in quite some time. And when he talked about whether or not Tanaka would be, have to be sacrificed if they re-sign DJ LeMahieu, didn't even address Tanaka, the pitching was yeah, the Players Association, tells us that we really can't talk about things like that. I was like, wait a minute, what? That was a outright sidestep.
The way that the question was phrased, too, wasn't a matter of just kind of bluntly, hey, or do you want to bring Masahiro Tanaka back?
It was if
you sign LeMahieu, can you still have the money to sign Masahiro Tanaka? And that's why you got the response from Brian Cashman.
Right, but if you want, for a guy who has been part of your organization for as long as Tanaka, for someone who has pitched in big games for you, and Tanaka, that, if I was Tanaka, I would not be feeling great coming out of that interview. So I would say he was a loser coming out of it. And honestly, Gleyber is kind of in between. Because, there was an acknowledgement at the end of the season, Moose, if you remember about Gleyber Torres. The big thing was, Cashman talked about his process, getting ready for games when they were talking about his defense and the errors and stuff, and, we need to tweak his pregame routine. Well, it turns out that's actually code for he needs to be in better shape.
Right.
And he was actually not in shape in the first 45 games of the season, of a 60-game season. That's a lot. So for Gleyber, they said, yes, he is a better second baseman than he is shortstop, but they still believe he can't play shortstop. But obviously the edict was you got to come into camp better shape. But they also made a lot of excuses. They made excuses for Gleyber, basically saying because spring training got split up, they can understand, and maybe forgive him being out of shape. And then for Gary, it was excuse after excuse after excuse. And I think as awesome as the Yankee fan is going to feel about DJ LeMahieu, because you don't talk about a guy like that if you're in the middle of trying to get a contract done in those kind of glowing terms.
He's going to be back.
Yeah, DJ's
going to be back.
You don't say that stuff. You don't go that far.
Make sure that LeMahieu's a Yankey. I mean, that's the way I
Everyone
come out of
relax.
it. That's the way I read that interview. That's the way that the Yankees, he wants to be here. The Yankees want him to be here. They have to go through this process of free agency, Maggie, but that's why I feel a lot better that the best overall Yankee the last 2 years, or year and a half, however you look at the 2020 campaign, the best hitter on the team for the last 2 years is going to be back in a Yankee uniform in 21. And that's good enough for me. So, I don't worry about the length of the deal. I don't worry about the amount of money. I feel pretty good about after hearing Brian Cashman last night. And you knew that the Yankees wanted to bring him back, but you started to get some reports about, we're willing to go to a certain point, but we want to be responsible with DJ LeMahieu, or we'd be unwilling to match the 5-year, $100 million deal if he gets that. Let's see DJ, there's unquestionably wants to be here. I feel much better about the Yankees' position and their thought process when it comes to their star hitter now after that interview than I did probably a couple days ago, because I got really frustrated as a Yankee fan watching this organization and talking about finances and talking about restrictions and being responsible after seeing some of the contracts that they've handed out historically. Now, I know it's a global pandemic. I know this year and this offseason is different than any other. That's fine, but it's still the Yankees, Maggie. It's still a team that's as valued as any in all of professional sports. They're not collecting. They're not having a piggy bank in order to get enough money together to sign DJ LeMahieu. We're talking about as financially sound an organization as there is in professional sports. So even with the losses, I feel a lot better now. Put the nonsense of earlier of the week in the rearview mirror, and I'm not even all that bothered about Masahiro Tanaka, because I am a little concerned about the regression in stuff and velocity when you've seen Tanaka.
Yeah, I kind of get the feeling the Yankee fans have kind of turned the corner on Tanaka, actually, and are kind of maybe ready to leave him in the rear view. And I know Yankee fans trust him, although this, particularly this postseason, which, there was that weird game, the wild card game in Cleveland, which was odd for him. But then obviously, the game against the Rays, and he gave up some runs in only 4 innings of work. But the thing is, I don't know, I kind of get that sense collectively from the Yankee fan that maybe, you're ready for the Tanaka era to maybe come to a close. It obviously depends on the money and the contract and that all that stuff. I wouldn't be so ready to turn the page on him quite yet, just considering you have a lot of question marks with that starting rotation. But the thing is about, and where I was actually kind of not surprised, because when they tendered Gary the contract, well, that was your answer, right? When you tendered Gary the contract, the answer was that he's going to be your starting catcher. Although this one comment from Cashman, and Ed, if you can get this one for me, I thought this was kind of a unique way to put it. I understand why he went there, Cashman did, with this particular excuse, but I thought this one was interesting. Go ahead, Ed.
The overall career he's had thus far gives us a little bit more hope that, this past season was unique, and don't really put all your eggs in that basket and expect that's who he really is. We don't think that's the case.
Wait a minute. The other one. But wait. Here's the one that the clip that I wanted. Maybe that wasn't the right one.
Well-oiled machine.
Yeah, we are off and ready to go here. What it was basically Cashman saying there were a lot of all-stars or all-star caliber level guys who did not give you a representative 2020. And he believes that Gary Sanchez falls into that category. And the same as
he's listening to Buck after the season on his post game. That is basically what Buck Showalter said after the Yankees got eliminated.
That's where I think that the Yankee fan is going to get frustrated with that. You get that they're going to make excuses for Gary, and that they're going to say his track record, that 2020 is so not indicative of who he is at the plate and all of that. But to say that it was just 2020. And this is the only reason why Yankee fans would have any concern about Gary Sanchez. That's not true. Yankee fans have been concerned about Gary Sanchez before this. I know he was an all-star in 2019, and Cashman reminded everyone of that. But still, the defensive deficiencies, of which at times I've tried to defend him, it's not that easy, because I know you guys don't think he's good back there. You think he's lazy, all of that stuff. We've heard it time and time again on the fan. To just say, chalk up Gary Sanchez's miscues to, well, that's 2020 for you, and say it in the same breath as the people who struggled this year, like the Edwin Encarnaciones and the JD Martinez's and the Chris Bryants and stuff like that. I just don't think that applies for Gary. I think the same concerns. It was as bad as could be for Gary at the plate in 2020, no doubt about it. But the concerns have been there. This is not something that popped up just because of the pandemic season.
Yeah, but you alleviate the concerns if the bat is there.
Right, but Gary was still a big strikeout guy.
Gary's strength is not his defense; it's what he provides offensively behind the plate. And Brian drilled down on that aspect, saying the swing and miss ratio was up, which was startling or eye-opening in 2020 for Sanchez. Yeah, he basically reiterated what Buck had to say after the season: don't get too high, don't get too low on any player, whether he strived or whether that player struggled. Given how strange this 2020 season was, for me, what hit home is the control of Cashman for this organization. Because I think if you took a straw poll from the Yankee office about belief in Gary Sanchez, I think Brian Cashman's probably holding 5 of those straws as compared to everybody else. He is in power, in control. There's great skepticism of whether or not Gary Sanchez can be an everyday catcher. Brian Cashman has been all in on the player for years now, talking him up when he was in the minor leagues. The Yankee fans have heard about Sanchez for years. When he finally came up, talking about the cracking, the ball sounds different when it explodes off of his bat. So what hit me, Maggie, is yes, once they decided to tender Gary Sanchez, he was coming back. But what it also shows you is the emotional investment that Brian Cashman has in the player. He's not willing to turn his back on that player just yet. Even though there are many people around Major League Baseball, a lot of guys that watch the game, that look at Gary Sanchez and say, listen, Gary is not an everyday catcher. He's just not. Square peg, round hole. He's never going to be able to figure out. He's never going to be comfortable enough. Make use of his greatest asset. He's an everyday DH. Well, the Yankees don't have that opportunity because they've got Giancarlo Stanton, who can't play the outfield. But what it shows to me is, if you ever had any questions about where Brian Cashman sits, and we were having this talk and conversation about potentially Steve Cohen wooing him at one point in time when Cohen was the winner of that and eventually took control as majority owner of the Mets, and whether or not Brian Cashman would ever leave the Yankees, Cashman has complete and utter control. Because I think Gary Sanchez is back with this organization because of one man. And I think that is the general manager. I think it's Brian Cashman, because he's got so much skin in the game on the player and believes so mightily in the player. That is why Gary is back. And I don't think Brian Cashman could bring himself to the idea of watching Gary Sanchez figure it out with another organization and be that 35 home run catcher. I don't think Brian Cashman at this stage, with as much skin in the game, could bring himself to that. And that's why Sanchez is back.
Yeah, I mean, or he actually believes it, right? He actually believes that Gary's career is going to take, is going to, put 2020 in the rear view, or any of the concerns you may have had even before 2020, and it's going to go back to when he first came up as a baby bomber, and it's going to continue. So he might actually believe it. I thought it was funny when he's like, no one hit the ball harder amongst catchers than Gary Sanchez. I'm like, yeah, but if it's only once out every 15 times, then
I know.
Matter?
Well, he's grasping at stuff. I mean, but that just shows you the belief that the general manager has in the player. And listen, it was also refreshing to me to hear the criticism of Gleyber Torres, at least after the season when people were questioning whether or not Gleyber Torres is a shortstop. Well, at least Brian Cashman came and admitted last night, listen, Gleyber's a better second baseman than he is a shortstop. We believe in the player. He also said Gleyber Torres in spring training, part 1 was in shape. Spring training part 2 was not, as you mentioned, Maggie, and that he's got to show up in camp ready to go and in peak shape. But they still believe that he is and can play shortstop. But it was great to hear him admit, well, yes, honestly, he's a better second baseman defensively than he is shortstop. He's a lot more comfortable there than he is at manning the other position. That was refreshing. That was good to hear.
Well, because that's something you've been saying.
Well,
so
it's true.
You like the validation.
Thank God it's
but
true.
Bruce, he also said he can play the position. So they're not telling you that they're going to move him to second. They're saying he can play the position, and I think they're hoping that if he's in better shape, it will lead to better results.